the bargain. Sitting on his couch, James Monaro frowned when his ringing cell phone interrupted his baseball game. He shrugged, his team was losing right now anyway. Picking up the cell phone, he looked at the ID and knew where the call was coming from. James' frown deepened. He thought for a moment about just letting the call go to voicemail, but answered it instead. "Hello." He heard his mom's familiar sigh before he heard her voice. "It's your father, James, he's had a heart attack. I know you aren't on good terms with either of us right now, but I thought you should know. He's still your father and..." Peggy Monaro's voice broke and James could hear her crying. This was the last thing he needed. He hadn't spoken to either of his parents in 5 years and still wasn't ready to forgive them yet. James supposed he loved both his parents, he just hadn't liked either of them since that day 5 years ago when they had accused him of stealing $500 from them. Even when they found out the money had actually been taken by Hal Monaro, James' uncle, James hadn't got much of an apology. James' dad, Sonny Monaro, had tried to cover for his worthless brother, Hal. All James got was a half-assed apology. James couldn't believe his parents had ever believed he would steal from them and wasn't happy with the less than perfect apology. He hadn't spoken with either his mom or dad since then. Now, with his mom saying his dad had just had a heart attack, James felt torn. He worried about his dad, but was still so hurt by the past accusations. James cleared his throat. Will he make it? Peggy was sniffling and trying to get herself under control. He'll live, but he is going to have a rough go for a little while. He's in the hospital at least a couple more days before they will be moving him to the rehabilitation center. James nodded at the semi-good news. Thanks for letting me know. Peggy didn't like the cool tone of her son's voice. Will you see him? James gripped his cell phone tightly. No, I think it would be better if I didn't do that right now. Peggy was crying again. He's your dad. James was nodding. He is my dad, and if he thought anything of me, he'd know I wasn't a thief like Uncle Hal. James could still hear his mom crying and almost gave in, but instead shook his head. You need to let me think about it for a couple days. Maybe by the time he goes to this rehab place, I'll want to see him. Peggy's voice when it came back was a quiet plea. I hope you will, James. We know how wrong we were. People make mistakes. James nodded. Yes, they do, thanks for letting me know about Dad. James hung up the phone before his mom could answer. He set his cell phone down on the coffee table in front of him and ran both hands through his dark hair. He felt bad about the way he handled the call, but he still couldn't find a way to get over the hurt caused by his parents. Even now he felt like someone had just punched him in his stomach. James had always been close to his parents and had thought they had a great relationship. He supposed that's why their accusation had floored him so badly and why now, 5 years later, he found it so hard to forgive them. James grabbed the TV controller from the table and turned off the game. He felt like he needed to get out of the house. The walls felt like they were closing in on him and his thoughts. James stepped outside and smiled as he turned and looked at his motorcycle sitting in his driveway. Just what he needed right now was a ride on his bike to take his mind off his troubles. James walked over to his carport and grabbed his helmet, before jumping on his bike and then pulling out of his driveway. The fall-like weather was still warm enough that even though he'd forgotten to grab a jacket, his long-sleeve shirt was enough to keep him warm. James headed to the edge of town where there was a city park. He was hoping when he got there, the place would be empty enough he could find a secluded spot to think and clear his head. Right now, all he could see in his mind's eye were flashes of special times he had spent with his parents. Those memories went back to when he was just a small boy and all were happy. James was so preoccupied with his thoughts that he didn't see the old pickup truck that came barreling through the intersection. He felt it, however, as the front of the truck hit him from the side, smashing his leg into the side of his bike. Then the truck, never slowing down, pushed the bike with James on it, across the intersection. It took another truck, parked across the road, to finally stop the motion. James and his bike were crushed between the vehicles. James didn't even have time to scream before everything faded to black. Feeling something pulling at him, James felt relief that the rescuers were there so fast. Frowning, James realized he was not being pulled to a waiting emergency vehicle, but instead up and away from the wreck. Looking down, James could see his own mangled body lying in a pool of blood and still wedged between one truck's grill and the other truck's passenger door. James stared in bewildered shock as once again the blackness overcame him. A few moments later, James blinked his eyes against the brilliant white light. James frowned and looked around. His brown eyes grew wide in shock. That's when James felt his legs go weak and he dropped to the ground. He looked down at the emerald grass he had sat on. His hands, on either side of him, ran through it feeling the velvety softness of the grass. James looked up and could see several white buildings about 50 feet in front of him. The buildings were so bright and clean James had to put a hand up to shade his eyes. When he did, he saw an older man and a younger woman walking toward him. The man stepped up first. Jack started to try and stand up, but the man shook his head. "Just stay there, you might be a bit shaky anyway." Leaning over, the man put out his hand and James shook it. The man smiled, his light blue eyes shining. "Welcome, I'm Lucas and this." He pointed at the woman who had stepped up next to him. "This is Melody." James nodded at Melody, who smiled and waved. James frowned and looked back at Lucas. "Am I?" James shook his head, not wanting to say the word he was thinking. Jack rephrased his thoughts. "I didn't make it, did I?" Lucas smiled and sat on the grass so he was facing James. Melody took a seat next to Lucas. Staring at James, Lucas continued to grin. "Let's say your earthly body didn't make it." James looked down as he felt his legs experimentally. "I don't feel any pain, but I do feel like I have a normal body." James shook his head. "I saw my body when I was pulled away from that wreck." It was Melody who smiled and answered. "That body is no good to you here. The one you have now will never have to feel pain again." James turned to stare at Melody, noticing how pretty her brown eyes were. "That's good to know, but I'm afraid I can't stay here. There must be some kind of mistake. I really need to go and see my parents. My dad just had a heart attack and if I, died, my mom will be in bad shape. I really need to see both of them again. I have to let them know I forgive them." Shaking his head, Lucas laughed lightly. "It's no mistake, James Monaro. This is where you are meant to be." James frowned. "How do you know my name?" Lucas smiled. I know all about you, James. I also know about the problems with your parents. It is my job to know. James stared at Lucas. Then you know I have to go back. I have to say I'm sorry. I can't live with myself if I don't. James frowned at his own words. After all, he was dead. I mean, in my heart. You can't imagine how heavy my heart feels. James looked from Lucas to Melody, trying to think of how to explain what he was feeling in a clearer way. Melody's beautiful brown eyes filled with sorrow. You need to let go, James. This is not a place for heavy hearts. Lucas nodded, his blonde hair falling over his forehead with emotion. He pushed it back and stared at James. Melody is right, James. In fact, when you crossed over, the pain inside should have been left behind, just like the pain outside. Shaking his head, James frowned. Apparently it didn't. I tell you, this is all a mistake. I have to go back. Lucas was silent a moment, his brow furrowed. Then his eyes narrowed as he tried to think about what James was saying. He turned to Melody. Would you take James and show him around the greeting center? I need to have a meeting with the advisors. Lucas turned back to James. Your accident was not a mistake. It was scheduled and it was your time to cross over. Lucas saw James was getting ready to argue and held up a hand. Let me go have a talk with the others. Melody can show you around while I'm gone. Before James could say anything, Lucas had stood up and walked away. James turned to Melody, who smiled, her whole face lighting up. She patted James' knee. Don't worry, Lucas knows what he is doing. Melody stood and held out her hand. Come on, let's go to the center. James stood and took Melody's hand. She laughed and the sound was like music. Don't look so worried, things will turn out. Melody led James to the largest building that James had noticed when he first came to this place. The building looked dome-shaped at first, but as they got closer, James realized it was actually 12-sided. Melody led him through the double doors that stood wide open. She turned to James after they entered. This is the center. Everyone who arrives is brought here. Melody pointed at the desks that were set along the outer walls of the open room. Each desk had someone sitting at it with a large book open in front of them. People were in lines in front of the desks. Most of the lines had 3 or 4 people in them. This is where your assignment will be given. We all have different levels here and everyone has tasks that they are also given that come with a level designation. Melody shrugged. For now that will have to wait until Lucas comes back. Melody pulled lightly on James' hand. He had forgotten he was still holding on to it. Why don't we go and get you some food? I bet you're hungry. James frowned. Do you eat here? Melody laughed. Of course we eat. Did you think we would starve you? James shrugged. I guess I never really thought about it much either way. Shaking her head, Melody led James outside and then on a golden-colored sidewalk that almost looked clear, and over to another building. James stopped walking when they got about halfway there. Melody looked at him. Is something wrong? James shook his head. Can I ask you a question? Melody smiled. Sure, I am your guide, ask away. James looked at her frowning. How long have you been here? Melody tipped her head slightly, thinking. I don't really know. Time is different here. We don't go by days and years. I have to say it has been a long while though. James nodded. Do you miss it? I mean the place you came from before you got here. Melody shook her head. I miss my family sometimes. But they will all eventually join me. That's all that matters. James frowned. Did you get along with them, your family I mean? Staring at James, Melody nodded. Of course I did. Well, at least I remember that we were always happy. When you cross over, all bad thoughts and worries leave. Melody's hand covered her mouth in surprise. Oh my, yours didn't though. That's why you want to go back. I have never heard of that before. I guess that's why Lucas went to talk to the advisors. Melody's brown eyes looked sad. I'm sorry for your pain, James. That's why it is so special here, no pain, either physical or mental. Don't worry, James, Lucas will get you fixed up. The two started walking again and went into the next building. James' eyes widened in surprise at the tables inside laden with food. Several people sat at other tables, eating and talking. To James, it looked like a huge celebration. Melody was smiling. Let's get you a plate of food and find a place to sit. The two walked to a table in the center of the room. James picked up what looked like a piece of fruit, although it was unlike any fruit he had seen before. James was surprised when Melody told him the large piece of fruit he was eating was actually a pear. It was easily triple the size of any he had ever seen and twice as sweet. By the time James finished his second piece of fruit, Lucas stepped in the room. He motioned at James to come over. Both James and Melody stood and walked to the door where Lucas was standing. As soon as they joined him, Lucas looked at James. Let's go outside and talk. The trio walked out and over to the grassy spot where James had first found himself. Melody looked at James, then turned to Lucas. Do you want me to go? Shaking his head, Lucas shrugged. No, you can stay. We have no secrets here. James has been approved for a 24-hour trip. He has to find a way to resolve his feelings in that time period. If he can't, I'm afraid he will be a floater. Melody gasped and James frowned. What's a floater? I'm guessing it's not a good thing. Lucas raised an eyebrow. I think that depends on a lot of things. Basically, being a floater means you are stuck between worlds because of the negative feelings you carry. The general rule is for you, in the process of crossing over, to leave all negative feelings behind, like you did your body. Shaking his head, James stared at Lucas, confusion written all over his face. That doesn't make sense. What about all the people that say they were visited by angels? Are they floaters too? Lucas shook his head. No, they are guardian angels. They are trained and assigned that duty. They are allowed to come and go between worlds. Floaters do not have that option. They are forced to live between worlds. James took a deep breath. What if I am able to resolve my problems but it takes me longer than the 24 hours? Will I still be allowed to return here? As Lucas shook his head, James could see deep sorrow in the man's light blue eyes. I wish I could tell you yes, but I'm afraid the answer is no. This is your only chance to fix things and return. No one who carries the negative feelings you have can stay here. For some reason you weren't able to release your issues in the crossover. I personally think it is your own guilt, and that's why this is something you will have to find your own way to fix. You will be sent back in spirit form. Lucas stared at James. I have to warn you, it isn't always easy to make your presence known. Some people are open to spiritual visitations while others are the exact opposite. All I can say is I wish you luck. I really hope you will be able to rejoin us within the 24 hours. Melody nodded. I feel the same way, James, you belong with us. I want you to come back. James started to nod and then felt himself being pulled away from the two people he had just met. The light seemed to fade as James lost sight of this beautiful place. Then he was standing in his parents' quiet living room. James scanned the empty room quickly before heading to the room his mom always spent most of her time in. Stepping through the kitchen's doorway, James saw his mother sitting at the kitchen table. Her back was to him, but her shoulders were slumped. James could feel his heart breaking at the sad gesture. He stepped over and placed a hand on his mom's slender shoulder. It's me, Mom. Peggy Monaro didn't move or act like she felt her son's presence. James frowned, he had thought his mom would be the one to feel him. He looked around the kitchen wondering where his dad was. Peggy stood and walked over to the counter and grabbed her purse. James followed her out of the house and to her car. James stepped through the closed door and took his place in the passenger seat. He smiled at his new talent. Pretty cool to be able to walk through closed doors. Peggy backed up the car and started down the road, radio playing softly. James turned to her. Where are we going, Mom? As James spoke, the radio crackled. Janet reached for the knob and adjusted it. When the music played again static-free, Peggy sat back in her seat and resumed driving. James decided to not speak yet. It only took a few minutes for the car to reach the rehab center that sat next to the hospital. Peggy got out and James followed her through the building to his dad's room. James let out a sad sigh when he saw his dad. Sonny Monaro looked 20 years older and at least 20 pounds lighter than the man James had last seen 5 years ago, when communications had broken off. Peggy went straight to where Sonny sat in his hospital bed. She leaned over and kissed his cheek. How are you feeling today? Sonny smiled wearily, his brown eyes, so like James, looked tired. The doctor tells me just a couple more days and I should be able to come home. Peggy frowned. It's lonely there without you. Sonny took her hand. I know it is, honey. I also know how much you have been doing alone. I wish I could have been out of this place to help you with the funeral. Peggy had to turn her head away, not wanting her husband to see her tear-filled blue eyes. A moment later she was able to turn back to look at him and give him a small smile. It's okay, Sonny, my mom and sister helped a lot. When you get out of here we'll go and pick out a headstone. Peggy shook her head. James was so young, it's just not fair. Sonny just stared at his wife, not having any words to help. James stepped up to the foot of his dad's bed. He didn't have much time to try and make a connection. He knew he had to figure out a way. James didn't want to become one of those floaters Melody and Lucas had talked about. Maybe if he could find a way to cross back over he could become his parents' guardian angel and be able to visit them. James looked at his dad. I'm here, Dad, can you hear me? Can you feel me? James didn't see any recognition of his presence. He pounded one hand on the end of his dad's bed in frustration and was surprised to not only hear a sound but to also see both of his parents frown and look his way. Peggy's eyes widened as she turned back to her husband. What was that? Sonny shrugged. I have no idea. Sonny pushed back his covers and slid his legs over the side of the bed and then stood up. Peggy stepped back as Sonny walked past her and went to the foot of his bed. Reaching out his hand, Sonny made a fist and knocked on the footboard. The sound was louder than the one they had just heard, but similar. Frowning, Sonny shook his head. That's really strange. I'm sure the sound came from here. Peggy nodded. That's what it sounded like to me. Standing next to his dad, James felt tears in his eyes, that were so like his dad's. He reached out and put a hand on his dad's shoulder and clamped down. To James' surprise, his dad lifted his own hand and placed it on his shoulder also. For Sonny, it felt like his shoulder was suddenly warm and he felt a sense of peace wash over him. The one whispered word shocked James as he heard his dad say his name. James nodded, even though he knew neither his mom or dad could see the gesture. I came back to let you know I am sorry. I love both of you and I am sorry for the years I wasted acting stupid. I love you and hope you can forgive me. I hope you can understand what I am trying to say. James could see tears in his dad's eyes now as he stared in wonder at his wife. Peggy stepped over to stand next to her husband. When she did, James flipped an arm around her shoulders. By the look on her face, James knew that she too could feel him there. James smiled. I'm so sorry, I love you both and always will. As his words were spoken, James felt the tugging he had felt after the wreck. As the darkness he moved returned to the brilliant, beautiful light, James felt his emotions rise. He felt at peace and knew the bargain he had made with Lucas made the crossover this time a success.
Thanks for watching and please subscribe and share the video. That boosts us to create more videos.
And see you next time guys.